On the day I went away, was all I had to say. I want to come again and stay. Smile, and that will mean I'm there. 'Cause I've seen blue skies through the tears in my eyes, and I realize I'm going home. I'm going home. Everywhere it's been the same. Like I'm outside in the rain, free to try and find a game. Cards for sorrow, cards for pain. 'Cause I've seen blue skies through the tears in my eyes, and I realize I'm going home. I'm going home. I'm going home. I'm going
Good morning, guys. It's Tuesday the 5th of November 2019, and it's a very warm mid-spring day. We're already in the 30s now. That's a bit unusual for this time of the year here in New Zealand. So the prediction is it's going to be a hot, long summer here. I've titled this podcast Basic Training, and today I'm going to discuss what the initiatory system that I teach offers to a novice student when they first enter our serious training. So if you've been watching the previous podcasts leading up to this one, I will have explained that there's a necessary level of background information that a new student into our serious training needs to have already behind them before starting the serious training, and I've discussed the details about that in the previous podcast. So initially the training that we offered was not entry level. In other words, if you were relatively new at the study of Western Hermetism or Western occultism in general, if you were accepted for training in our system, you would find it fairly extreme, and a lot of the language would be over your head, technical language, and you would suffer and probably end up in failing very quickly due to a lack of understanding of basic concepts in Kabbalah, psychology, Western Hermetism in general. because we don't teach all these super basic concepts, all these entry-level concepts. We required our students in the past to have done that study for themselves and to have been involved probably in some other kind of organised esoteric school, Western esoteric school, before they joined us. So it's kind of like leaving high school and applying to start university. If you don't have that high school education behind you, when you start university, they're going to be teaching at a level which you find very difficult to understand, and that's the same in the group that I run. So I'm not going to talk about initiatory training in general, or as other groups provide it. And we need to make a clear distinction here between mainstream initiatory training, which I've discussed in past podcasts, and what I call authentic or underground stream Hermetic initiatory training. There's a big difference between the two, because what popular or mainstream occultism calls initiation is not really initiation at all. All it is a ritualized, often ritualized but not always, invitation into a study mostly of intellectual knowledge in some school. That's not what initiation was originally. That's a very modern kind of a concept. Initially when the Hermetic tradition first was created and developed, initiation was a training process that you went through in order to prepare you for the important stages of personal self-spiritual development. And it didn't involve a lot of study of intellectual knowledge, lectures and books and things like that. It primarily was a set of exercises that you needed to go through. So I'm not going to talk about the training that other groups provide, primarily for a couple of reasons. First of all, in the Western tradition today, there are virtually no authentic initiatory bodies. There are virtually none. And I can safely say that after years and years of searching and talking with a lot of people and belonging to a lot of different groups and listening to gossip and information that's being passed from the top down into, advanced level students, I've never come across another authentic initiatory body in the modern Western Hermetic tradition. Having said that, I'm not trying to claim that the system that I teach is the only authentic initiatory body in the Western tradition today. I still insist, when people ask me questions about this subject, that it is highly likely that there are other initiatory bodies that are teaching authentic Western initiation, but we simply don't know about them, and I've never personally come across them. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Primarily because authentic initiatory bodies prefer to stay secret. And for a long time, the school which I oversee, which is known as the Heredom Group, primarily stayed secret itself during its the larger portion of its developmental stages. And this was done mostly to stop outside counteractive forces, shall we say, individuals and groups, from having a negative impact on what we were doing. It's much easier to work when you're not being influenced by bad players from the outside, shall we say. But we're slowly making a move to bring a part of our training system into the public, and this is one of the reasons why I'm talking about this kind of information relative to the Heredom Group now in my podcasts, largely because I'm constantly being asked about the Heredom Group, and I'm constantly being asked about our worldview and the kind of training that we offer by serious people who are interested in possibly studying our worldview and becoming involved in our training system. So I'm not going to talk about how other schools deal with authentic initiation. From this point on, during the podcast in this series where I'm talking about initiatory training, I'm going to be speaking, you can take it for granted that I'm going to be speaking primarily about the Heredom Group's methods and theories and philosophy itself, except where I specifically refer to other groups. So all I will say at this point is that initiation for anybody, in any culture, in any tradition, it's all based on one archetypal process. There are natural laws in nature, which govern the fact that initiation can be effected or affected. These natural laws allow us to be able to evolve ourselves spiritually. If there weren't natural laws already built into the fabric of our reality that allowed us spiritual self-development, then even if we came up with the idea of maybe this is possible, let's try and work it out, it wouldn't work, it wouldn't happen, it wouldn't be possible. Nature has to allow it to happen first, and therefore allowing it to happen, it has a set of rules upon which the process can unfold. And so all of the esoteric training processes that exist in various schools of esoteric knowledge in different cultures, different times, different parts of the world, they're all based on this basic natural formula, no matter what they look like in that culture. So when I talk now about Heredom's approach to initiation, what you're looking at is a description of one particular school's design for initiation, which is based on the archetypal or natural pattern for initiation. The first thing that I should probably say about this design or pattern, about Heredom's specific process for initiation, is that I myself primarily are responsible for the design of the system which I'm going to describe to you. It was described or passed on to me by my teachers, and I was allowed to format it and design it into a system which suited my particular point of view. Let's say that. The basic natural laws were described to me, upon which all initiation is based, and the system that we see in Heredom today is my expression of those natural laws, the way I personally see things. And other tutors which I have taught over time to teach our system all put their own specific twist on the overall format that they have been taught, and so each teacher has their own slightly different way of doing things and seeing things, but each of their teaching processes is based on the same system, and as long as it adheres to the rules, the natural laws of that system, then their training works as effectively as the one I designed in the first place. So as far as the history and the source of where the training we provide comes from, all I will say in public is that I inherited the instruction of how to design such an initiatory system from my teachers. There was more than one individual, and they helped me in a question and answer kind of a way to design the Heredom system that I'm going to be describing to you now. So, taking into consideration that in the past, things are going to change from now on slightly in the way we accept new students and people are presented into the training system that we offer. So I'm going to largely talk about how things have been done in the past while we were developing the system, experimenting with it, testing it, and setting those things that we have proven to work in a structured format, which has become the system we teach today. So when a new person enters our system, as I said previously, they really require a sturdy background in previous Western Hermetic training. Having studied Eastern mysticism, yoga, Qigong, whatever, is of no help at all. Western esoteric systems operate on a completely opposite basis to how Western systems operate. So it's extremely difficult for a person who spent a large chunk of their time as a student of esoteric science studying and practicing Eastern techniques. It's very difficult for them to switch to the Western way of seeing things. They can't help constantly trying to translate concepts and terms in their head from Western into Eastern, and it simply doesn't work. And they fall behind because they're not keeping up with the pace of training, because they don't really understand what it is that's being taught to them. Also, people from Eastern practices who have been practicing Eastern techniques for a long time, those techniques approach spiritual self-development from completely the opposite angle to Western aims and methods. So once a student of the Eastern esoteric tradition's mind is set in a particular Eastern orientated pattern, it's very hard to break that pattern because it becomes a habit, and then switch it back to front and start doing things from a Western point of view. So we also insisted that new entrants, novices, were not deeply involved in Eastern practices if they also had a background in Western esoteric study. Occasionally during the history of the Hiram Group, we did allow people with primarily an Eastern background to attempt our training, but in every single case these individuals have failed. Not because our process doesn't work, because it has proved to work many times. It's because they can't get their head around a system which is basically back to front to the Eastern tradition. So the beginning level of Heredom's training is what I've always referred to as basic training, and students at that level are what we refer to as novices. No matter how far you might have gone in mainstream or popular level esoteric education in the past, when you start our training you're a novice, and most students who come into our training very quickly realize why they are considered and referred to as novices, because getting your head around what we teach is a huge quantum leap forward from where the top of popular occultism peaks out. So our basic training is divided into 4 levels, each of which is based around or constructed around an exercise. It's important to know from the beginning that traditional Western Hermetism, its spiritual self-development exercises, are all rooted in different systems of using the imagination to manipulate the contents of the mind. So this is the first concept that it is important to grasp. Traditional Western Hermetism, where spiritual self-development is concerned, the practical exercise part of those systems, the one thing that they all have in common is that they are methods and techniques for using the imagination to manipulate the content of the mind. So when you're considering whether or not a system that you become involved with is authentic Western Hermetism, spiritual self-development, if that system is not teaching a very deep, detailed and technical system of psychology based on the use of the imagination, then whatever that system is claiming is probably not accurate or factual or true to the Hermetic tradition. So the 4 exercises in the Heredom Group's basic training are exercises that teach essential knowledge and techniques that are required to be understood if you're going to embark upon a journey which largely involves altering your personal psychology through the use of the imagination. So the first technique lays the rules for carrying out what we might call the meditation exercises that form the basis of Heredom's inner work process. That's the general name that we give this entire process inside of Heredom, is alchemical inner work, because the process is alchemical. It follows the spagyric pattern applied to the mind, and it is an internal work compared to the outer laboratory alchemical work. So the first exercise teaches you the basic rules of carrying out a meditational exercise, and these rules have to be adhered to for the rest of the training up until the stage that we refer to as knowledge and conversation with the higher genius, which I will describe in detail in a later podcast. So these rules are important and need to be adhered to absolutely strictly in order to stop the student from affecting their mind in a way which will encourage mental illness. The moment you start trying to manipulate and alter the content of your psyche, especially along esoteric lines, because we're going into largely unknown territory when we do that, there is a large danger of causing mental illness if the proper and healthy rules of mental functioning aren't maintained. So the first exercise that a new novice student is taught is how to carry out meditations without those meditations adversely affecting their psychological health. And we know that these exercises work because people who get to the end of the entire inner work process and have carried out everything according to the strict rule attain knowledge and conversation with the higher genius and maintain a healthy psychological state, or even a hyper healthy psychological state. We also know that students who think that they are smarter than the system and who start whittling down the rules and shortcutting things or completely avoiding them altogether and then lying to their teacher that they are sticking to the strict rules, we know that these kinds of students end up with serious mental illness, which then has to be dealt with. And of course that's the end of their training. Any student who can't stick to the rules properly and the safety measures, maintain the safety measures, has no place in serious esoteric training. And this process is serious. It's not a game. If you don't carry out the process properly, there are potential risks of damaging your psyche. That's the cost of carrying out psychological practices which are designed to exalt your psychological state. If you want to get the greatest gains from your mind spiritually, there are risks involved in that if you break the rules. But the rules are clear and known, and we state them carefully and teach them repeatedly to students. But unfortunately there are some people who think that they are exempt from good practice and safe behavior. They think they're Superman and the rules don't apply to them, and they eventually get themselves into a dangerous situation. So exercise 1 lays the basic rules of how to safely enter deep into your own psyche and begin to manipulate your imagination. There are a couple of other serious mainstream schools who also teach these safety rules, but they don't really place a lot of emphasis on the fact that they are safety protocols and that not adhering to them can cause serious mental illness. So some of these systems have become publicized, have been published in public literature or discussed online. People who are not involved in the original schools those systems were taught in grab that information and start playing around with it, and again think that the rules don't apply to them and that they can take shortcuts and cut the system down to a simple approach, and they end up either getting no results or they end up causing themselves trouble. Safety is the first precaution of an authentic training system. In the second exercise that we teach, we re-emphasize the safety rules, add a few more rules to the original list that has to be memorized and practiced, and the primary focus of the second exercise is a technique for communicating with psychological intelligences. By psychological intelligences, I refer specifically to what psychologists would call sub-personalities. In other words, they're fractions of your individual psyche, pieces of your psyche that you can communicate with, and archetypes. These are the psychological entities, intelligences that exist at the peak of your individual psyche, but they also exist in the collective unconscious as well. And the old esoteric tradition has given these intelligences many different kinds of names, such as demons, angels, gods, and so forth. But we in Heredom, we collect these entities all under one overarching banner label of intelligences, because that's what they are. They are intelligent, living, developing entities. So the historically traditional Western Hermetic self-initiation practices have always focused specifically on the manipulation and interaction with psychological intelligences through the use of the imagination as the primary tool. So what I've said about the imagination and the manipulation of the psyche just previously, I'm now adding on to it that specifically what this means is most of the practices that an initiate is involved in require him to interact with and manipulate intelligences productively. So exercise number 2 teaches the basic rules of how we need to go about that. In the same way that in normal everyday physical life, you just can't go up to anybody in the street and behave towards them in any way that you want, that in every country and in every culture there are rules for personal interaction. The same thing exists in the mind. When you go into the mind and you meet with intelligences and you want to have productive interactions with them, there are rules, and they are the rules established by those intelligences themselves. They are not just dumb automatons, they are intelligent, evolving entities, and they live in a society of their own nature, governed by their own rules. And when we go into our psyche using our imagination to interact with these intelligences, we are going into their territory, and we have to behave according to their rules. So exercise number 2 in basic training focuses primarily on how we interact with psychological intelligences and how we keep those interactions safe. Or should I say safe and productive, because that's the next thing. There's no point in interacting with these intelligences if nothing significant in the journey of spiritual self-development results from those interactions. It's all good and fine to use your imagination and go in and chat with entities that live in the psyche, in the psychological universe, but our goal here is spiritual self-development, and our method is spiritual self-development through interaction with these intelligences. And this is a very, very old approach to spiritual self-development in the systems which predated the present Western Hermetic tradition. In other words, in Middle Eastern cultures where we inherited these techniques from, they use the same methods. And in the Western Hermetic tradition, in the much distant past, this method of interacting with psychological intelligences was what was referred to as Solomonic magic. But in saying that, and I'm going to discuss this particular subject in a lot of detail in later podcasts, Solomonic magic, and now referring to this term in the podcast, I need to point out clearly that what you may know about Solomonic magic from having studied or even practiced that system in the mainstream of Western Hermetism is a shadow of what is known about the potential use of that system and the original proper productive use of that system, particularly where spiritual self-development is concerned. So every novice needs to understand what these intelligences are and how to interact with them safely and productively. So exercise number 2 in basic training focuses on teaching the basic rules of that process, and from exercise number 2 onwards, every exercise that is performed revolves around interacting with different types of psychological intelligence and learning their nature and the benefits of interacting with them, where primarily but not entirely spiritual self-development is concerned. Exercise number 3 focuses on teaching the technique for retrieving deep memory from the unconscious. On the journey of spiritual self-development, one of the tools which plays an extremely beneficial role in spiritual self-development is the ability to be able to dig down into your unconscious mind and retrieve memories of your early, present life, or what is allegedly referred to, or so-called past life recall, subject which I will also talk about in more detail later on, because that's not entirely what people would like us to believe it is. Nevertheless, the technique for retrieving memories from your early life, from your childhood, your adolescence, your early adult life, and being able to relive, review those memories, and to be able to manipulate them in particular kinds of ways, and also the ability to be able to go beyond this present life into other states of conscious awareness, let's just put it that way, is particularly beneficial. And I don't know of anybody who, following traditional, old school, and I mean almost ancient, because the Western Hermetic tradition ideally is not part of the ancient tradition, since it was only born at the end of the 9th century in the format that we are familiar with it today. So it's part of the classic era, really. The ancient era belongs to the schools from which we inherited our knowledge in the Middle East. I don't know of anybody who can follow this path of spiritual self-development without eventually getting themselves into a situation where it is necessary to go back and dig into memory and understand more clearly things that have happened in the past, or gain the benefits from things that have happened in the past that of a kind that presently are not even dreamed of by most modern mainstream Western occultists. So the third basic training exercise is all about how to get into the unconscious and retrieve memory accurately, safely, and productively. And we call this regression, basically, stealing a term from modern hypnotherapy or hypnosis. The fourth exercise in basic training focuses entirely on what we refer to as or should I say more accurately, what alchemists refer to as the lingua verde, or the green language of Hermetism, or particularly of alchemists. Alchemists refer to this language, or in Europe at least they did until relatively modern times, until it was reintroduced by a guy who called himself Fulcanelli. We refer to this particular language as the lingua verde, or the green language. Those of you who are familiar with Western magical tradition have probably heard this referred to as the angelic language, or the language of the birds, which comes directly from the Middle East, or the magical language. And basically it is the language of symbolism, how entities how intelligences before they developed a conscious analytical thinking mind, a ruach in Kabbalistic terms, before we developed conscious thinking ruach, and we live primarily in the nefesh, or the animal soul, the means of communication between entities that exist at that level is what we call the universal, or the angelic, or the magical, or the green language, the language of the birds. And it is a language common to all sentient beings, not just beings that have a rational faculty active in their psyche. So exercise number 4 teaches what this language is, how to recognize it, and then how to use it on the journey to spiritual self-development. And this is important because the lingua verde, or the universal language, is the language with which reality itself is coded. If we think of our reality as being like a virtual reality, the software of our reality is coded in the lingua verde, in the green language. Language, the spoken word and the written word, and particularly the symbols which make up the consonants and vowels, shall we say metaphorically, of the universal language, are of so much importance to the Hermetic tradition that in legend the intelligence which has been attributed with the action of teaching humanity magic, in other words the Egyptian Thoth Hermes, one of the personal attributes that he had was that he was a master of language and taught language to humanity. And Thoth, before anything else, was a magician. And the reason why he was a master of the spoken and written language is because magic relies almost entirely on the mechanics of language in order to create and manipulate realities. And so the very first language, the language which is actually used to code reality in, the lingua verde, is the subject of the 4th basic training exercise, and which teaches how to recognize the symbols of that language and how to read them. When entering into the human psyche, it's like going to a foreign country which nobody's ever heard of before, and of which we know nothing about the culture and the language. And before you go, you need somebody from that culture, from that country, to teach you the customs and the language first. Otherwise you won't be able to function in that country properly. So learning the lingua verde, or the magical language, or the language of the birds, is absolutely necessary. And I'm not talking about a metaphor here. I'm literally talking about learning how to speak the universal language in order to be able to function in the psyche productively. In other words, the intelligences with which you interact in the psyche at a personal level or at the level of the collective unconscious, you can't communicate with them properly if you do not know how to speak the tongue, as it were. So these are the 4 basic training exercises which are provided to all novices when they enter the Heredom Group's initiatory training process, the novitiate process of starting their journey towards spiritual self-development. They are preparatory exercises. In other words, it's like being a carpenter and first having to learn how to use a hammer, a screwdriver, a drill and a saw. You can't build a house if you don't know how to use the tools, and so basic training provides the student with these tools. And we can see remnants of this kind of training in the modern pop occult tradition. There are things about the universal language, example, which are very well known in the modern pop culture Western Hermetic tradition, but most people who get taught those things are being taught only part of the knowledge about them and almost nothing about their value in practice, although they are a substantial part of intellectual training in mainstream modern Western Hermetic esoteric schools. So talking with intelligences in the poor, messy, broken down version of the Solomonic magic tradition that we have available to us today in the popular or mainstream level of Western Hermetism. Those are the bits and pieces of a once ancient and detailed and very deep and elaborate knowledge about the manipulation of psychological entities, intelligences, which has almost been lost to Western culture today. In fact, it's almost been lost to almost every culture. The rules for entering the psyche, for performing meditations, if you like, that are part of spiritual self-development exercises, these rules, only the barest shell of them still exists in some serious popular schools, mainstream schools. And most people who are learning these rules and these systems really don't understand what they are. Even the people who are teaching them don't even really understand what they are anymore. And big chunks of the technical understanding and the technical use of these safety rules have also been lost. And the value of regressive motion or regressive manipulation of the psyche, going into the unconscious, deep unconscious, and retrieving and interacting with deep unconscious memory, is also something which is almost completely lost from the popular level of Western Hermetism. When we see all these 4 things lined up and taught properly, taught in depth, taught with technical proficiency, with the proper use of the technical language which is used to label and discuss these subjects, it very quickly becomes obvious what a proper, let's say authentic Hermetic training system should really look like, and what they must have once looked like in the past, when real adepts were actually achieving serious results from their esoteric training. Unlike today, where there's a lot of people calling themselves adepts who, for all intents and purposes, can't do anything magical or anything alchemical, except for quoting information from books and dressing up and role-playing. So those are the 4 primary exercises which we provide new students. It's very difficult to work your way through those 4 exercises if you are unfamiliar with how esoteric schools operate, with what's expected of the relationship between a student and a teacher in esoteric training. If you're not used to the language, particularly the basic language of Kabbalah, you'll struggle because we're not translating everything that's being said into common language. More often than not, when we present the basic training, everything's discussed in technical language, and you're expected to be familiar enough with that technical language in order to think in it. It's like learning another language from another country. You don't truly become a part of that other culture's language until you start thinking in it as well as talking in it. On top of those 4 exercises, there's a whole bunch of important things that the student is taught and has to learn. And they are things like they have to learn to communicate effectively with a teacher. They have to learn to keep accurate and legible reports of all the meditations that they perform. This is necessary so that in future stages of the initiatory training, the student can look back at the details of previous meditations and start to stitch things together about what was being told to them in early meditations and now what is being presented in later meditations. The whole process is holistic. It's not just one event happens here in one meditation and then you're on to the next. They all add up to build like a house. You build the floor first, and then the walls, and then the ceilings, and then you put the windows and the electricity in, and then a decor. It's exactly the same with training. It's not just one thing today and something different tomorrow. They all are like building blocks that fit together to build an edifice of spiritual self-development. Other things that are necessary to learn are being reliable, being honest. You can't attain to knowledge and conversation with the higher genius if one of your primary life skills is to get the things you need by bullshitting everybody, or by being a con man, or by stealing things that don't belong to you. The search for knowledge and conversation with the higher genius is a search ultimately for the ultimate truth, and that ultimate truth can't be gained through dishonesty. So the student has to learn to practice rigid honesty about his own journey, about his personal feelings and thoughts. He needs to communicate those things properly, and he needs to communicate them in a way that expresses exactly what he is feeling and seeing and thinking about the various aspects of the journey itself. There are deadlines which have to be met. You have to learn to have discipline and work within strict deadlines, because momentum on the journey is important. Each stage in the process builds up momentum towards the eventual final knowledge and conversation. You can't have huge long gaps between exercises where the teacher doesn't know what's going on with the student, and the student is sitting in the background gnawing away on things that he's uncomfortable about, or just simply being lazy and not even thinking about training. That doesn't work in authentic training. Discipline is essential. Deadlines for completing exercises are important, and if you don't keep to those things, then training usually comes to a swift halt. One of the other concepts which needs to be understood and accepted is that if you fail training because of some weakness in your personality, such as you can't be honest, or you can't express your feelings about what's going on properly, or you can't articulate your thoughts about the entire subject properly, then that failure in training is definitely a failure. It's not, oh, I've screwed up here, I'll come back to it later, because 35 years or more of experience in teaching hundreds of students has taught me that when you give students who mess up a second chance, they always screw up worse the second time around. I'm not talking about students whose training stops because of some mishap, some unavoidable so-called accident, or because of some inadequacy on the part of the tutor that couldn't previously be predicted. I'm talking about students who lose their training because of bad behavior of some kind, or because of a fault in their character or personality which they refuse to address and repair. It has shown that students who fail and come back for a second chance, when we in the past have offered that on rare occasions, in the gap between failure and being allowed back in, they never do anything to fix themselves. They just sit there and wait to be asked or offered or accepted to have a second chance and come back into training. In other words, they come back into training with the same problem that they got booted out for in the first place, and within weeks or months they're back out of the system again, and that's the end of it. So it is extremely important that new novices understand that this is not a game, that if you muck about and you get ejected from the system, that there will be no second chance, there's no comeback. No teacher wants to take on a student who can't communicate properly, or who is dishonest, or who is unreliable. No teacher wants a student like that. Not because they think that person is a bad person for any reason, but you simply can't instruct people who lie, or who are unreliable, or who can't communicate properly, or who refuse to communicate properly, or in the final estimation, novices or students who simply won't learn or can't learn. There's no point in taking on a student like that. So as soon as any new student during basic training is discovered to have one of these problems, and the teacher helps them to try and repair that problem, and it is shown that they're not interested in repairing the problem, or they simply can't because they're not intelligent enough, or they're not psychologically flexible enough to repair the problem, then that's basically the end of their experience with an attempt at spiritual self-development. And this is one of the, from the tutor's point of view, this is one of the main aspects of basic training that the tutor is focusing on. He's looking at the student's psyche, how he responds to the exercises that he has to perform, the results that he gets, and the way he interacts with the tutor himself, in order to gauge the student's suitability for proper advanced training. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the future podcasts. But the very next podcast, I'm going to talk about an important subject which some of you may have heard whispers of, or mention of, in the popular or mainstream before, but I can almost guarantee you'll have heard no detail about it, or no description of exactly what it is and what its place in the Western Hermetic tradition is. So basic training is like learn the basic tools while your tutor assesses your suitability for proper training, for what we call advanced training. If you don't manage to get through those 4 exercises properly and flunk, then that's the end of it. But if you get to the end of the 4th exercise, the exercise and lesson in the lingua verde, and you do that successfully, the very next stage of the process is what we call a meeting with the guardian upon the threshold. This is the archetypal intelligence that exists in every human being's psyche, in the unconscious, which guards the deep unconscious mind from intrusion by your average non-initiate. So there is a psychological entity and intelligence and archetype whose job is specifically to keep you out of the deep unconscious mind. And there are a number of reasons for that, which I won't discuss here right now, but which we're going to enter into in detail in the next podcast. So this meeting with and interaction with the guardian upon the threshold is the true beginning of advanced or adept initiatory progress. Anybody who has not been through a meeting and interaction and successful outcome with this guardian is not adept. They're also not in proper Hermetic training. And so this is a key important subject to be discussing when we're talking overall about the subject of Hermetic initiation. And so I'm going to cover that in the next podcast. So I think that's enough for now. I'm not quite sure how long that's taken us. Feels like close to an hour. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next podcast.
On the day I went away, was all I had to say. I want to come again and stay. Smile, and that will mean I'm there. 'Cause I've seen blue skies through the tears in my eyes, and I realize I'm going home. I'm going home. Everywhere it's been the same. Like I'm outside in the rain, free to try and find a game. Cards for sorrow, cards for pain. 'Cause I've seen blue skies through the tears in my eyes, and I realize I'm going home. going home. I'm going home.